The secret garden was what Mary called it when she was thinking of it. She liked the name, and she liked still more the feeling that when its beautiful old walls shut her in, no one knew where she was. It seemed almost like being shut out of the world in some fairy place. The few books she had read and liked had been fairy story books, and she had read of secret gardens in some of the stories. Sometimes people went to sleep in them for 100 years, which she thought must be rather stupid. She had no intention of going to sleep, and in fact was becoming wider awake every day that passed at Misselthwaite.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you, Rory, for that lovely introduction from the Secret Garden. And to our lovely listeners and viewers on YouTube, we are today talking about an extraordinary landscape and country house in Yorkshire, which was the filming location for the Secret Garden movie. And that is why Rory read the intro. And Rory, can you tell us, because the Secret Garden obviously is about a secret walled garden, but actually today's episode is on a much bigger and more extraordinary garden, isn't it?
It is, yes. We're doing the Studley Royal Water Park, which is just fabulous. I have to say, I was saying to you actually before we were recording, Jeff. I mean, I love researching this week. It was just, God, it's beautiful. We're going to have a really fun episode talking about it today. But yes, the Secret Garden was filmed there. And as we'll discover, that the two have a lot in common. Not perhaps through design. It's not a kind of Victorian walled garden, but in terms of ambience and a kind of magic quality, that there's something similar going on.
Okay, so we need to go back several hundred years to the time of the South Sea Bubble. And I want you to tell me, Rory, who was John Abbey and what did he create?
Okay, so this is fun, isn't it? Kind of beautiful garden, South Sea Bubble. There's a big cognitive dissonance there. So, yes, John Abbey was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So for people who aren't in England, that means that he was basically our top finance bro. And he was involved in a total disaster. He was involved. Well, he was made Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1718, and then 2 years later, he was involved in this thing called the South Sea Bubble, which was sort of an 18th century version of the 2008 financial crash. It was an absolute disaster. The English economy imploded. Basically, they had this brilliant harebrained scheme that they would go off and trade with South America. But they rapidly discovered that because South America was largely owned by Spanish-speaking empires, that they weren't very happy to trade with England. And so no trade occurred. But in London, meanwhile, there was a craze for buying shares in this new company. Everyone thought it was going to be the next big thing. So the shares went up and up and up in value, but there was no trade to support them. And eventually the bubble burst. And
it was essentially the first and most high-profile Ponzi scheme.
Other than the Dutch tulip bulb situation, yes, the other great disaster. But
I mean, it's extraordinary. Yeah. You look at the tulip bubble, and it's like, people were paying the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds for a single tulip bulb. I mean, it's madness, isn't it?
Absolute madness. I mean, they were actually quite nice, the tulip bulbs, but I mean, this was sort of even more bonkers because people were investing in basically hot air.
Yeah.
So he somehow, because he's a very clever man, John Abbey, but somehow he sort of helped to engineer this complete financial cock up.
And some people who sold at the right time made a lot of money from the South Sea Bubble, and others lost fortunes, didn't they?
Yes, the whole thing was marred in scandal by the end because there was sort of insider trading, and some people were clocking on to the fact that it was worthless and were buying out, and just all of that kind of thing. So it was he was disgraced, and he was expelled from Parliament, and he decided to respond by going home. So he went up to Yorkshire, where he was from, and he invested all his energies into designing a commiseration garden, essentially.
So when are we talking? Is this sort of 18th century, 17th century?
Yeah, so he was born in the 17th century, but he was Chancellor in the sort of early, in the 1718, 1720. And he starts the garden in about 1718. Basically, is when it begins. Okay. And as we'll see, it's quite a long process. The design process takes a while, but that's when it started. And He he, as with so many grand men of the 18th century, he is obsessed with landscaping. But he, as we'll discover, puts a bit of a novel spin on it. So there are three, broadly speaking, three phases to his version of the garden. And each one is sort of more beautiful than the next, really. Now, it would help listeners if they would like to know more about Studley Royal Gardens. If you hopefully I will get an image of this on our YouTube, so you can have a look at it there. But there are very helpful maps on Google, and you can sort of see what we're talking about in a bit more detail, because it is a tad complicated. But basically, imagine a snaking valley, very deep valley as you get in Yorkshire. And he basically created a formal water garden in the kind of wider valley, the wider section of the valley. And that consisted of a series of canals, which were a very sort of formal 17th century thing, partly inspired by Holland. So wide, flat, kind of straight rivers, essentially, going down to a series of cascades. And they fed into a big lake. Now, what made this rather more distinctive is that next to one of these great canals, he had dug a series of moon and crescent ponds. So imagine a sort of a big round sphere moon-shaped pond, very big, and then flanking it two half moons, sort of crescent shapes, and with sort of grass walks in between. And the effect is really rather amazing, because as you're walking around on these paths between these great flat glass-like surfaces of water, you sort of it's a very odd experience, because you're surrounded by so much reflection, but you're also on these sort of beautiful jewel-like green walkways, and you're not quite sure also where the paths are going. It's a little bit like being in a water maze. And you're surrounded by these very, very high hills on either side of you. You're kind of, as I said, in this very deep valley. So the effect is remarkable and very, very soothing. But anyway, the cascades leading down to the big sort of holding water pen, the lake, were sort of flanked by a couple of pavilions, beautiful Palladian pavilions with Venetian windows, and they're called fishing lodges. The fishing lodges. As I said, all this is framed by this lovely valley, which is sort of improved with hedges and laurel banks and so on, to kind of make you feel like you're in a wilderness, but it's all very sort of, it's beautifully trimmed and kind of curated. And actually, we'll talk about this a bit later, why this is unusual. But what he's doing here is already very unusual for the time. But this is essentially the first phase, which lasts until about 1730. And then in the 1730s, the early 1730s, he builds probably the most famous element of this part of the garden, which is called the Temple of Piety. And the Temple of Piety is a really astonishingly beautiful folly which sits in front of the moon pool, or the moon lake, this lovely round pond that I mentioned with the half crescents sort of next to it. And it's a lovely yellow ochre temple. I mean, it really looks like it's something that's been lifted out of something in the Veneto and straight into Yorkshire. It's just exquisite. It was used as for me, the reason I'm so familiar with it is it was used as the thumbnail image on the front of Tom Stoppard's Arcadia, the play. So that gives you a sense of its kind of vibe. But remarkable sort of temple nestled into this bank, this high bank, and in front of it these incredible pools of water. They also built a banqueting house, which was very lovely, sort of nice, heavily rusticated banqueting house on the hill overlooking this collection of things. And then in the late 1730s, and this was John's kind of final moment, they built a very early octagon strawberry Gothic tower, which is usual strawberry Gothic thing, kind of weird combination of classicism and the Gothic, and lots of paths and grottos and things winding around the woods of the kind of the top of the valley around this creation, if that makes any sense. So that was the sort of first. Are you still with me, Jeff? That's the first section of this. The first
Yeah.
3 sections of this garden.
Yeah. And Rory, did you feature any of the follies in your book?
Do you know what? I was going to, and then I didn't, because for some, I can't remember why now, but it didn't quite make sense, because the book was also a sort of journey through England and journey through English history, and I think because I was already doing Stowe and Castle Howard, I didn't really need to do Studley Royal as well.
So Studley Royal, I suppose it is one of the great sort of romantic landscapes of England, like Stourhead and Stowe, but it's of an even bigger scale, isn't it? Because I suppose is it because Yorkshire's a bigger county? Why is it that Studley Royal is such a? I mean, I look at the photographs of Studley Royal. I've never been there, and it's sort of is actually very different to Stowe and Stourhead, isn't it? Because Stowe and Stourhead were done to look pastoral. They were done to look natural, like the way the lake curved and whatever. Whereas Studley Royal, it is a massive formal garden, really, isn't it?
Well, it's extraordinary. I mean, we'll get later on as to why it's quite so extraordinary, but at least even John Aileby's contribution is very unusual, because what he basically created a landscape in a very dramatic pre-existing landscape. He liked the natural topography, and he used that to frame a very formal 17th century garden. And that was really radical for the time, because most of these gardens, these formal gardens in the 17th and early 18th century, were in, flat parterres in front of houses. So to do this in what we would today see as a pretty romantic landscape was really unusual. And I think that's partly what distinguishes it. Yes, I mean, Stourhead and Stowe, it's all sort of gently rolling and lovely, and the same with West Wickham.
And we're talking. This is. I think Capability Brown was born in 1716, and this garden was created in 1720, 1730.
Between
So this is sort of quite pioneering, isn't it? Because pre-Capability Brown, gardens were formal gardens generally, and what you've got here is you've got a pre-Capability Brown sort of romantic landscape, really, haven't you? Which is quite unusual.
It is unusual. I mean, it's about the time of William Kent.
So Rousham, which was the first sort of famous garden in the English landscape style.
I'm not sure. I can't remember if it was the first. I'm a bit rusty on my landscape gardens, but for listeners, I did my my dissertation at university on this subject. So at one point,
interestingly, actually, I think Rousham was also done around the same time as Studley Royal, sort of no, it was done earlier. It was done Was it done in the early 1700s? Yeah,
Rousham was super early. I mean, Chiswick was very early with Lord Burlington. It was part of the gang between Pope, Burlington, and Kent, but they were certainly some of the earliest ones. They were. I mean, Studley Royal's first section isn't that different. I mean, they were notable for being much smaller in scale and full of follies, whereas Brown's ones, are much vaster and have fewer follies. But I mean, Rousham and Chiswick don't have these incredible water features, and the landscapes obviously, by definition, can't be as dramatic. They're not in North Yorkshire, and as we'll see, they don't have the additions that were later added as well. But I'm trying to think about the question of whether they were more pioneering. I think it's the choice of site from John Aileby, deciding to go for this area, which is quite so dramatic, and contrast it with this highly formal layout, was extremely unusual, and makes for I think a more impressive effect.
And Rory, can you just so we've talked about the water gardens, we've talked about this dramatic landscape, but can you I know it's really hard to describe a garden, but can you describe how he designed it and what was so, I suppose, unusual about it, apart from the these is the focuses, these extraordinary water features? But can you sort of expand a bit, walk us through the garden and with for the listeners?
Okay, well, we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. And this will also help us to lead to the next section of the garden, which was taken on by John's son. But if you start at the bottom, there's a big lake, which has this big cascade, and flanking the cascade are these two fishing lodges, which are beautiful Palladian fishing lodges. They're like little sentry, so one window across kind of sentry posts. and then you work your way. And this is a big sort of basin, by the way. You feel like you're at the bottom. I mean, you feel like you're at the bottom of the valley because you kind of are. And then you find yourself on this sort of artificial plateau surrounded by very high, steep banks. So for those who shoot, you feel like you're at the bottom of the valley. You might be having pheasants driven over you. For those who don't shoot, you feel like you're at the bottom of a kind of very English version of the Grand Canyon. And you have these. It's very odd. You have these very, very straight, formal canals. Which are, I mean, are beautifully cut. I mean, like sort of, perpendicular sort of razor cut sort of banks that lead straight down to them. It's all very clipped and lovely. And then to their left, if you're walking up the valley, you have these huge ponds, which, as I said, in the shape of the moon and sort of crescent moons, leading in this big semicircle, leading to this wonderful folly, the Temple of Piety, almost cut into the bank, and it's sort of almost protruding out as though it looks like a sort of, well, it looks very sort of pagan. I mean, it's kind of it could almost be lost in the shrubbery, and it's this beautiful yellow color, and the effect of walking around that zone of the garden is profoundly peaceful. You hear the water trickling, you have these reflections, all the trees above, which are very much above you, reflected in the pools below. Not quite sure where you are as well, because there are so many different, the paths are crisscrossed by so many different bits of water that you get a bit lost, but in a very nice way. It's just a profoundly, I mean, literally reflective environment. And then if you keep going up, you will find the valley sort of snakes around and it becomes more serpentine, which was more fashionable later on in the century when the English landscape movement was taking on. And this was the brainwave of John's son, William Aislabie. And he kind of takes the garden on into the fourth and final phase, which, in my opinion, is possibly the most magnificent. So William inherits in 1742. And by this point, the English landscape movement's beginning to pick up pace. And he decides to build on his father's legacy. And he, does some more low-key things. So he adds the Temple of Fame, for example, which is a nice neoclassical rotunda, rather like at Stowe or at Versailles. More neoclassical in tone, simpler, reflecting the shifting fashions. But what he does, which is far more significant, is he extends the sort of formal canals into a serpentine lake that kind of curves around this almost hairpin bend of the valley, and then leads a view up the valley into something else. And this is called the Surprise View, or Anne Boleyn's Seat. I've never quite worked out why it's called Anne Boleyn's Seat, but clearly she has something to do with the valley. But anyway, from Anne Boleyn's Seat, you have, to my mind, probably the most impressive view of any garden in England. And that's quite a big claim on this podcast, but I really do believe that. And you see the vast ruins of an English, in fact, the largest ruins of any English monastery here, basically, Fountains Abbey, framed by this valley, framed by the water going up to it. And it's just absolutely mind-boggling, really.
So Rory, we've got this sort of at the centerpiece of this estate. There's this ruined abbey, I suppose, originally a massive abbey that was destroyed in the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like, am I right in saying it's sort of, he's got all these little follies, these sort of the Temple of Piety, you've got the Gothic, the Studley Royal Gothic, and then really at the centerpiece you've got this extraordinary folly, which is a ruined abbey. Is that fair?
Yes, it is absolutely fair. I mean, it's just amazing. Sorry, I'm struggling for words, everyone. The Fountains Abbey was bought by William in 1767. So it was a neighbouring estate, and the ruins had just been sitting there doing their own thing for a couple of hundred years. But it's no exaggeration to say that it is one of the best preserved Cistercian monasteries in Europe and the largest monastic ruin in the UK. I mean,
wow.
Full stop, period. and it was just sitting at the end of the valley. It had nothing to do with the garden until this point. But William decided to clear the valley, extend the water, and to use the natural topography to frame this extraordinary building. So I think we probably ought to now segue a little bit, and I should probably talk a bit about Fountains Abbey itself to give listeners more of an idea. So the Abbey, I mean, it's just extraordinary. I mean, I wrote about this once, and when I was writing about it, the best way I could describe it was it's a bit like, because it's such a deep valley, and it's got this enormously tall tower sticking out of it. When you're walking along the valley top, all you can see is the top of this tower. And it's a little bit like the mast of a sunken ship. When you kind of see it, you see these sort of scattered ruins. It's like this huge ship which has sunk to the bottom of the valley and is sort of filled with treasures and things. And I think that's the best way of imagining this huge sort of scattered, collapsed abbey at the bottom of this watercourse. Anyway, but it was founded in 1132 by 13 Benedictine monks from York. And basically, these monks were pretty hardcore, and they got bored of the fact that their fellow monks were being too rowdy and extravagant in York, and decided they wanted to lead more sort of simple lives, essentially. So they got themselves enrolled in the Cistercian order, which was their new thing, and sort of fast-growing, and devoted to very, very serious monkiness. I mean, very hardcore seclusion and praying and all the rest of it. And they founded Fountains as a result. Now, we think it was called Fountains because of the springs and the watercourses that were pre-existing in this valley. So the River Skell runs through it, and I think it had a sister institution in Revo as well, which was around the corner. I mean, we need to do another thing on Revo, because Revo Abbey is also connected to the landscape garden. But anyway, and they were massively helped by the fact that the Cistercian order encouraged laymen to basically help. So they weren't monks, but they were sort of semi-holy, and the laymen would act as the laborers, and the monks could be left to pray and do more monkey stuff. And because the area was sort of naturally quite rich in kit, the abbey became very wealthy. The lay brothers were basically able to help with wool production, lead mining, cattle rearing, horse breeding, stone quarrying, things like that. And so rapidly, Fountains became one of the richest abbeys in Britain. Now, the architecture of it, which is pretty good today. I mean, it's very much a ruin, but it's such a vast building that even in its ruined state, it's absolutely magnificent. It's very, very Cistercian. So the Cistercians sort of believed in very plain architecture, but a kind of mighty and impressive architecture at the same time. Very keen on light and height, essentially.
Okay.
But this was best manifested in a series of aspects of the abbey. So their cloister was remarkable. It was inlaid with black marble and white sandstone. So really, really striking. There was the abbot Marmaduke Hubie, that's a fantastic name, kind of wanted to show a moment of revival after the Black Death, and he built what's called the Great Tower. I referred to it earlier as the mast of this ship. It's really amazing. Huge, great big thing, a bit like Magdalen Tower, for those of you who are familiar with Magdalen College in Oxford. Similar scale, similar size. And that was... that now towers, still exists to this day, towers over the view that we're talking about. So those were probably two of the more impressive elements. And the other thing is this vast window. The east window also remains. So when you're looking at this view up from the kind of formal element of the garden into the abbey, what your eye is particularly drawn by is this vast window, this kind of portal almost, really. And then on its right is this big, big, big tower. And the ruin, I mean, it must be the size of it's the size of a train station. It's really quite big. Anyway, and then what happened? I mean, almost needless to say, Fountains was leapt on by the church. So it was closed in 1539. sorry, not close by the church, close by the king. Forgive me.
King Henry VIII. This is
Yeah,
for our
King Henry
listeners.
VIII.
Monasteries, yeah.
As one of the wealthiest monasteries in the country, it was an obvious sort of apple that he wanted to pluck.
But it wasn't. But interestingly, it wasn't razed to the ground, was it? It was, or was it stripped? Was it stripped of its assets?
I think they tried, but it was so big, it was almost impossible to. It was. I think. Well, so Fountains Hall. So the area was bought by the estate was bought by Sir Richard Gresham, who was the father of Thomas Gresham, the famous merchant who founded Gresham School and all that jazz. And then they sold it on after that to a guy called Stephen Proctor, who in 1597 built Fountains Hall, which is a very beautiful sort of Jacobean, highly symmetrical small prodigy house, basically, with a lovely kind of oriel window in the middle of it. It's really nice. It's really well done. And that was partly built out of the Abbey. So a lot of the stone was quarried from it. But when the Abbey is 3 times the size of the house, so they didn't need all of the stone from it.
And was it built near the Abbey, the Fountains Hall?
Yes, very, very nearby. Probably about a 10-minute, 15-minute walk or something.
Oh, fine, okay,
very close. But the Abbey was just left to do its own thing. I mean, I think that the I'm not sure if it was the Greshams or the Proctors, but one of the kind of like conditions of being given a sort of previously monastic estate is that you had to basically make the monastery uninhabitable. So pull the roofs off, make sure it can't be used, and they did do that.
What I'm intrigued about is there was this combination of the two estates, Studley Royal and Fountains, and it was William Aislabie who sort of helped merge them into one through expanding the landscape garden. Is that right? But were there then 2 principal houses? Was there a Studley Royal house and Fountains Hall at this point?
No. So by this point, Fountains Hall was a subsidiary house. It was simply used as it was used variously as a courthouse, estate lodgings, and a farmer's house. So,
okay, so the principal house was on the Studley Royal estate.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, got you. Okay.
But it doesn't seem that the family, the Aislabies, I mean, they did lavish attention on it, but nowhere near on the scale of the garden.
And what was Rory when this sort of merger happened? How did William Aislabie sort of? I mean, you mentioned he extended the water gardens. How did he sort of combine the two successfully? And what, I suppose, was the effect of that?
Well, I think it's various. I think it's lots of different things. I think to my mind, it's probably the most impressive. It's the best romantic garden. I mean, it's hard. English landscape gardens are slightly strange things because on one end of the spectrum, you've got the very formal versions, which are kind of more early 18th century. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they also encapsulate very romantic gardens, but they're all called English landscape garden. So it's a bit of a kind of movable feast. But what's wonderful about the Fountains and Studley Royal collaboration is that it encapsulates both aspects of the English landscape garden. So I think it's probably, I'd say it's probably the best encapsulation of a romantic landscape garden. There's something incredibly, obviously Gothic about the Abbey at the end of the view. It kind of looms over you. It's mysterious. It's slightly scary. It's also very touching. I mean, it's a monument to a lost world. This really was one of the spiritual powerhouses in Europe, and it's just sitting there now. And it is immensely beautiful. The architecture, even in a ruinous state, is very fine. It's this lost treasure ship. But then you've also got the very formal element, these beautiful ponds which reflect all this light and the trees, and create this deeply sort of meditative space. And so I think that the combination of that meditation, and then also the drama of the Abbey and the meditation that you get from that as well, and Tempus Fugit and Carpe Diem and all this jazz, it's just incredibly special. And it's not often that you have a garden that that has such a range of periods so beautifully presented. What do you think? Have you been to fountains, Jeff?
I haven't, no, but I've been slightly distracted, Rory, looking at it on Google Maps, and it isn't. I know it's funny, but it is extraordinary because what I always find extraordinary with these grand gardens is often the water is a key part of it. You look at Blenheim or Castle or whatever, the lakes are very important. Yet they often come from damming very small streams. And what I find interesting looking at fountains and Studley Royal is actually the River Skell is not a significant river, but very cleverly through damming the lake and so forth, he creates this really significant river through the landscape, and then it reverts back to being narrow. So it's really interesting. So you look at it on Google Maps, and it's this little stream really until it reaches the Abbey, and then suddenly, because of the way they dammed it further down, you get this. It becomes a much wider river, a sort of waterway that curves around, sort of meanders, doesn't it? And then it suddenly becomes sort of formal canals with sort of formal ponds on either side, and then it reaches the big lake at the bottom, and then there's a cascade, and then it reverts to being a little stream again. And it's really funny. You look at it, and it's amazing how through the technology they were sort of pioneering at the time, I guess, of damming and cascades and stuff, how they managed to essentially create what looks like a natural but very grand landscape from quite a small river, really.
And that was started actually by the monks. So the monks began the process of damming in order to, I don't know, improve water supply and stuff like that. But yes, it is amazing. And one of the things I again love about this area is this garden is that when you go round the Serpentine Bend and up, you walk up towards the Abbey. The Skell, the River Skell, the watercourse, it's quite narrow at that point, and it really looks like a beautiful little sort of chalk stream. It's got lovely. I remember vividly. It has this beautiful weed growing underneath it, which kind of sparkles, really bright green water weed. So very, very clear water, and it's surrounded by flower meadows on each side of the bank, and it's so pastoral. And then, of course, it expands and becomes much more formal and kind of gracious. But it's almost speechless, listeners. Almost speechless. You got to go. You got to go. But I mean, there are other really famous. This is not the only garden that incorporates
No, I mean that's what I was thinking. But what I find interesting with Studley Royal is it seems to be a sort of halfway house in that you have the great landscapes of England that we've talked about before, likes of Stourhead and Stowe, Milton Abbey. These very pastoral, the great Capability Brown landscapes. Let's call it that. These landscapes. For our listeners, prior to sort of this period, gardens were, as Rory said, sort of formal parterres and ornamental gardens and whatever, and then. And everyone knows about Capability Brown sort of transforming that into creating a landscape that looks like it's natural, even though it's entirely fabricated. But what's interesting with Studley Royal is it sort of is a halfway house, and that it is both natural looking and romantic. It looks very pastoral, but at the same time, the formality of the canals and the ponds, the formal ponds, make it a formal garden. It's sort of a formal garden and a park at the same time, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think the juxtaposition is much more interesting, really. I mean, and also people always make the mistake of, and it's a very common mistake, but everyone sort of says English landscape garden, Capability Brown. They think he must have been the guy who invented it, but he absolutely wasn't. I mean, the first, and it didn't happen immediately, but the first romantic elements in gardens. So you have formal gardens, and they'd have kind of wildernesses in them, for example. They're occurring in the mid to late 17th century. And it's those wildernesses in the kind of fringes of the gardens, the formal gardens, that grow over time to take over the whole garden by the mid 18th century. So, frankly, if I'm being totally honest, I think that Capability Brown's landscapes are rather sterile. I mean, they're so simple. I mean, hit back at me, Jeff. Tell me I'm wrong.
No, I mean, I think he was a genius. But what I think he was a genius with, and I think, in fact, I think the reason why I think he was so clever was he was able to envisage what the park would look like in 100, 200, 300 years time. So I find it, when Capability Brown
Mm.
was creating these landscapes, he didn't ever see them as he intended them, because he planted saplings that would never grow to, full height until long after he had died. And what I think was so clever with Capability Brown was he was able to know exactly where to plant trees, especially clusters of trees within a formal park, within his landscape, such that when they were at full height in 150, 200 years, they would be the right scale. There'll be the right number of trees in a certain,
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think that was what was so clever with him, is whereas Studley Royal, because it's got the formal aspects to it, it kind of, you get the immediate, he would have got that immediate gratification. He would have been able to, once the canal was dug, it looked great. Whereas, when you think about Capability Brown, he had these lakes that were dammed that were then framed by clusters of trees, but he would have never seen that. He could just picture what it would look like. I think I would err, Rory, as someone who likes it, who's always wanting sort of the quick fix, the immediate gratification of, I'm not very patient. I like, if I was talking to a friend the other week who has this wonderful topia in his garden, and he planted it when they were just little yew trees that he bought for sort of £10 or something, and he just patiently over 20 years cultivated them, whereas I would probably pay a lot more money for a fully grown one straight away, because I don't want to be patient and wait. And I feel in many ways the Ailebys got that here, because they got both their sort of informal park, and they got their immediate hit of having the dam. I mean, water's so clever, because you can change landscape quite quickly if you dam a stream or a river in a way that you can't if you plant a wood, for example, which will take 50 years to grow. And so they were able, I suppose, I wonder how long it took to fill those rivers, those canals and those lakes, because it is a little stream. I wonder when they dammed it. And also the other thing I always wonder is, they can't have dammed it completely, because otherwise the river would have dried up further down. So they must, I can never work out, I don't know if you know this, Rory, how they dam, you look at a lake now at Fountains Royal, and it's dammed, and then there's a weir, and the river carries on to, when they built that weir, when they built that dam, did the river run dry further down until the lake was filled? It's something I've always wondered, because I know at Milton Abbey, when they dammed the river, it ran dry further down, and people had to desert their homes and villages because they didn't have any water further downstream. So I've always wondered this with someone like Fountains Royal, and I wonder how long it took for that, that lake to fill. I mean, what I find extraordinary, Rory, to be honest with you, is I look at these gardens, these landscapes, and I think, how did this was created 300, 400 years ago, and we don't, and yet we've got such, our technology is so much better now, and yet we don't see the creation of landscapes like this anymore. And is that because people don't have, labor's more expensive? I think about this in terms of buildings as well. Why don't we see, I look at cathedrals that were built in the medieval times, where they didn't have concrete, they didn't have, all the modern technology that we have, and yet they were able to build these extraordinary buildings. And why is it that we don't create landscapes like this anymore? And why is it that we don't create buildings like Fountains Abbey anymore?
Well, I mean, God, that's an enormous question, Jeff. I'm not sure we'd be able to adequately answer it right now. But in terms of the landscapes, I think in fairness, they are still being made. So I know an amazing Belgian landscape designer called Francois Goffinet, and he actually designs, still to this day, landscape parks for the kind of super rich in Europe, and the aristocracy and royal families and things, and they are amazing. So I've walked through him. I've walked through forests and fields with him plotting out with bamboo sticks where he wants avenues and where he's going to dig lakes, and so the knowledge is still there. There are people still doing it, but I think, why isn't it being done on a mass scale? Well, yes, because for all the reasons that people no longer really live in country houses. I mean, the labor is enormous. It's a big waste of land, ultimately, from an economic perspective. I think it's no longer cutting edge. I think that, it falls out of fashion long before people can no longer afford to make these landscapes. I mean, the Victorians are much less interested. For a while, it was the cutting edge thing. It was radical. The idea of embracing landscape into your home, into your garden, was very, very unusual, because up until that point, everyone had been desperately trying to grapple with nature, not make friends with it. And this garden in Yorkshire is one of the earliest examples of that in some of the most dramatic terrain that they had at the time. So I think that's unusual, and also this obsession with the cutting edge, rather than William Ellerby destroying his father's work, getting rid of the formal canals, which would have been unfashionable by the time he inherited. He keeps them. And so this, to see the succession, to see the change of the styles in one landscape, one watercourse, if you will, is amazing. And I think it's very satisfying because, as I said with Capability Brand's stuff, I think, as I say, I personally find it a bit sterile. So you have this highly formal canal system, which is kind of reflecting the world of parterres and Louis XIV jazz. And then you move up the valley and you get this kind of wonderful, fresh palate cleanser of wildflowers and serpentine paths and all this kind of jazz with this ruin. It means you get both. It satisfies both itches for the formal, the geometric, but done in water, which is in itself extraordinary, and also something more loose and free. I mean, I'm trying to think, like with Stourhead, and let's just for a second compare it to West Wickham, Stourhead, and Stowe, because those are considered to be the other great gardens. I mean, I think Stourhead's the readiest comparison because it has that huge lake in the middle. But I mean, how does it? I think it's Stourhead is more. It's more of a piece, really, isn't it? It's all built at roughly the same time, and the landscape is less dramatic. And then Stowe. I mean, Stowe's enormous. Stowe's more. Yeah, help me out here. What are your thoughts on how they compare?
I think is, I mean, I'm very fond of Stourhead. I suppose yes. I suppose what's different with both, well, with Stowe, the house is the centerpiece of the estate, right? The house is, sits above the lake, is the focal point, and it is an extraordinary building. Stourhead is slightly different because the house, you can't see the famous landscape from the house. You sort of go down this path through the wood, and it's sort of, the whole family who built it very much wanted to create, were inspired by the Greek myths and legends and wanted to create a sort of, road to Arcadia, wasn't it? A sort of path to Arcadia. Whereas, I suppose the interesting thing with Studley Royal is even when, and I want to talk a bit more about the house in a minute, but, there was Studley Royal House, but even that, it wasn't an extraordinary sort of great stately home, was it? It was, when you look at pictures, compared to the landscape took precedence, which I think is quite rare, because you look at these other landscapes, the likes of Stowe and Stourhead, and even, Rousham and West Wickham, the house is sort of suitable proportions to the estate,
a commensurate design. Yes,
exactly. Design. Whereas Studley Royal, even when yes, Fountains Hall was a sort of separate house that was the Jacobean house, it was sort of a small prodigy house, you said, but even Studley Royal House was a sort of relatively modest Georgian house, really, wasn't it? I mean, it had an extraordinary stable block, but you look at it and it wasn't a sort of one of the great palaces of England, like Blenheim or Castle Howard or something. And yet the landscape is one of the great landscapes of England. I think that's what's quite interesting, is this sort of disconnect between the house and the landscape.
You're right. It is odd because other people who were doing major landscape projects at the time in Yorkshire, like at Castle Howard, or which was still being built when the gardens were started at Studley Royal, or Wentworth Woodhouse. I'm trying to think of other great Yorkshire piles. Probably missed. And then there's that one at well, there's obviously Hovingham, and then there's the one on Revo. I can't remember its name. The Revo Terrace Walk. I mean, surrounded by massive piles. So it's kind of funny that they didn't want to compete. I don't know the answer to that. We simply know that John Ailerby kind of, I mean, literally drowned his sorrows in landscaping. I mean, he kind of he was. I mean,
was he ostracized by everyone? Was he sort of cut off by society?
Well, he was expelled from Parliament, which is pretty extraordinary if you were Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think he made a lot of people bankrupt, not deliberately, but so I imagine he was ostracized. Yes.
Yeah. So he sort of hid away and created this sort of safe space, you could say.
Yeah, and to that extent, it's not remotely unusual from Stourhead, because in Stourhead, I forget which, they're all called Henry Hoare. It's very confusing, but whichever Henry Hoare it was who designed it, he designed Stourhead because he was suffering bereavement. He'd managed to all his, I think, multiple wives and children all died, and his way of dealing with it was to sort of bury himself literally in landscaping. So it's funny, isn't it, how these traumas seem to be sort of somehow resolved through
It's sort
gardening.
of,
I mean,
a catalyst. I think often some of our greatest creations were created through, I think about beautiful buildings as well. Often they're built, the Taj Mahal built as a mausoleum, to honor, the wife of that, whichever Maharaja it was who built it.
Mumtaz, I think she was
Yeah,
called.
exactly. It's interesting. I think grief and love and things like that can drive people to create extraordinary and beautiful things. And on that, Rory, you started with this wonderful quote from The Secret Garden, and can you sort of circling back? Can you tell me why you started with that, and sort of what's its relevance?
I chose it because, well, firstly, the obvious connection that the Secret Garden was partly filmed at Studley Royal, and that's no surprise. I mean, the Secret Garden is about this almost ethereal garden, and Fountains has this similar quality. But I think what I particularly liked about the quote was she talks about being lost in a kind of fairy place. There's a magic quality to it, and I think that with the kind of the quality of the water and how water makes you deeply reflective, and then the other end, the ruins of this great abbey, it's like that wonderful in Xanadu. You see this great lost world, which is a sort of, again, it really gets you thinking. So I think that it has this deeply reflective quality. But I also think she talks about this thing of going to sleep and waking up and things sort of falling asleep, and I think that because of the abbey at the end, and because it's in quite good nick, you almost feel like it's asleep. You almost feel like you've discovered something that might resume, might come again. And I know that sounds very whimsical on a podcast, but if you visit this valley and you kind of imbibe it, you really do feel as though you're in a slightly the time just slows down and you're in a different space. And I think that's the quality of a really excellent landscape garden, and that's what it has in common with Stourhead and Stowe and West Wickham. These landscapes, you get immersed in them and you kind of just lose touch a bit.
Yeah. Okay. So that sort of leads on, I suppose, nicely to sort of as we sort of draw to a close. So there's this magic place that was created by the Ailebys.
Yeah.
What was its descent from there? Did it stay in the Aileby family? Was it sold out into someone else's family? And where did it end up? In the present day, you mentioned it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. How did it go from its creation to where we are today? What was the descent?
So the descent's very complicated, and it passes through numerous families. So I'm not going to bore listeners with all of that detail. But in essence, the garden is slightly left to not destroyed, but it kind of moulders through the kind of early 19th century, and then interest in it starts to pick up again when in the mid 19th century, especially with the kind of increased interest in antiquarianism, because everyone gets very interested in ruins and excavations and archaeology. So there's a lot of that around Fountains, the abbey itself, but also when Harrogate begins to become a thing in Yorkshire, it becomes a popular kind of spa town. There are increased visitors to Fountains. So even by the mid 19th century, there's a shilling fee introduced to visit. So that's all very exciting. It begins to become a place for a fun day out. In 1869, the third earliest bicycle race in England is held in the gardens. There are some other rather interesting things around. So there's St Mary's Church in the park, designed by William Burgess in 1871, which is an absolutely exquisite sort of Gothic revival parish church. Then, kind of moving forwards, you get as we discussed, the house is destroyed. Well, it's first destroyed by a fire in 1716, which John Ailerby rebuilds. But then in 1946, it's also damaged by a fire and it's not rebuilt. However, the stable block is tarted up. That was built for John Ailerby's race horses, and he's clearly very keen on horses. And it's a stunning Palladian house with lovely corn pavilions connected by arcades. So that still exists. That's sort of on the ridge over the valley. You can't see it, but it's nearby. So anyway, so that's all going on, and then finally, the family who, after the war, classic story, who lived in the house, basically can't keep it up. So the whole estate is basically given to the West Riding County Council, and then after that, it's bought by the National Trust in 1983. Now, at this
the
point,
buy it. They weren't given it. They bought it.
That's what I've got in my notes. I mean, it may be that they were given it. It's given in some way. It finds its way. I'm not going to confidently say.
No. It's interesting because so often it's interesting that it went to the council first rather than straight to the trust. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes, it's an interesting point actually. Okay. We do often say that, don't we? Yeah. Well, it winds its way into the National Trust.
Okay. And when did it become a UNESCO World Heritage Site? When was it awarded that title?
Okay, so it becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, and that is for two reasons. So I didn't know any of this until researching this. To become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, you have to meet very specific criteria, and the criteria it met were a feat of human creative genius, and that's me quoting from the literature. So it's considered to be remarkably forward-thinking for the time. And it's also considered to be a brilliant example of the type of heritage that it is. So a brilliant example of landscape gardening, forward-thinking landscape gardening, monastic architecture as well. So it's basically simultaneously remarkably forward-thinking and also exquisitely done. And that's why it was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, this is no small thing, listeners. I mean, let's just remember that this puts the Fountains Abbey and Studley Royal Garden alongside the Great Wall of China and the Pyramids of Giza. So this is quite a big deal to be made a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's done so because, as we've said, it's considered to be one of the great 18th, if not the greatest 18th century garden in the UK to survive. It's almost exactly the same as it was when it was initially created. It had the Secret Garden filmed in it. So that's why a lot of us, I think, when you visit it, will get this strange sense of deja vu, because you will have actually seen it in so many films, on so many paintings and book covers and things, but won't be aware of the fact that it's Studley Royal. So there we go. Little trot through Studley Royal.
Yeah, I mean, I must visit, and I would urge our listeners to too. I mean, it looks, from what I've seen, like one of the most magical places. And I suppose because it's in that wonderful part of Yorkshire, which is so sort of, well, it's got such a scale. For our listeners who aren't aware, Yorkshire is our biggest county. It is, everything in Yorkshire is on a bigger scale, isn't it? Every estate is bigger, every house is bigger, it's just got this wonderful rolling. If you imagine like how you see England in films, with these little villages tucked in between little, massive hills with dry stone walls, and it's such a beautiful county, and it's an extraordinary landscape. So thank you, Rory. You've given me a taste of Studley Royal. I think it's hard to capture a garden really in a podcast, isn't it? Or it's hard to capture anything really visual in an audio podcast, but you've done a very good job of it. Thank you, Rory.
Well, thank you, Jeff. That's very kind. I think listeners, I think if you haven't come across it, really do look it up. Do visit if you can. People often ask me if there was one place to, if you're country house spotting in the UK and you're not going to just be around London, where would you go? I would probably say Yorkshire. That's where you're going to have a really fantastic time. And this certainly is up there. I'll end by saying we can finish by me retelling a story I was telling you, Jeff, before we recorded. But my first and only experience of Studley Royal was very, very, very hungover. In fact, probably still drunk after a party in Yorkshire. And I got to this party, and a friend of mine was we were driving back, and we were all feeling pretty unwell, and decided that we probably ought to stop and just have a nice chilled afternoon. And we pulled into, we saw that Studley Royal was nearby, so we thought, well, that looks nice. And we, on this beautiful summer's day, still sort of heads reeling from the night before, found ourselves wandering through this kind of valley bottom with all the things that we've been talking about. And I remember just sort of thinking, am I in a dream? I mean, this is just absolutely amazing. I think the alcohol might have helped, but it was almost like a hallucination. There we go.
Well, thank you, Rory, for talking us through Studley Royal today, and thank you to our lovely listeners for joining us, and we hope you will join us again soon. Please do send in any questions to us, and we'd love to hear from you, and give us a good rating if you enjoy our podcast. That'd be much appreciated. Thank you.
And catch us on the YouTube as well.
Yes, please do view us on YouTube. Got plenty more wonderful content coming up. Thank you, Rory, for your time, and thank you to our listeners. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.